Everybody's looking good here.
Thank you.
Brian decided to put on his camera.
He's incognito here?
He's on mute though. Here, I'll take it off.
Oh.
You're still on mute. It won't let me unmute you, Brian.
Okay, how's that?
All right.
How's that?
All right.
Hey, Brian.
I thought I was supposed to be quiet.
You are. I broke the rules. Sorry.
Oh, Tony. So we'll give him what 3 more minutes, right, Jen?
Yep, about 3 more minutes.
Okay.
We'll let him talk for a little bit.
All right. Well.
Hey, Brian, I'm using several of your slides here, by the way.
Oh, well, don't say my name unless people like them, you know?
I want to give you credit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Hey.
Beth?
Hi, Beth.
So
Beth, you see the shirt I've got on?
all that help you've been given. We could have totally used tonight to recruit help for those kids.
Yeah, right. Everybody's looking good. All right.
So Lavella, I think I'm going to take the waiting room off, because when we put it onto the screen share, I don't think I can let people in. So I'm just gonna let people come in now.
Let's roll.
Yeah, so I'm gonna figure out this screen share. We ready to get started, Lavella?
We are ready.
Awesome.
All right. Welcome to the History of Noblesville, the first of a 4-part learning series sponsored by the Noblesville Diversity Coalition. Over the next several months, we'll go on a journey to explore our history, from its earliest beginnings to more recent eras. We'll discuss how understanding our diversity and awareness will propel us toward building relationships, caring for one another, and demonstrate the importance of being a welcoming community. Today's presentation is Pioneers, Diversity in Noblesville and Hamilton County, Indiana, the period around 1823 to 1851. Our panel today represents some of the diverse groups in the area at that time. Other groups may be highlighted in future presentations. I'm Lavella Heiter, a Noblesville Diversity Coalition board member and moderator this evening, and it's my honor to introduce you to our panel. First is David Highway, Hamilton County historian, native Hoosier, bachelor's in history at Western Kentucky University, master's in history from Utah State University. Worked at museums across the country. Currently employed at Hamilton East Public Library. He serves on the Noblesville Historic Preservation Commission and serves on the board of directors of the Hamilton County Historical Society. Next panelist is Diane Hunter, citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma, descendant of the Miami family of Sequitwica, and through their son, Gabriel Godfroy, pardon me for that, preserves and protects historic sites and resources, providing education about the presence and history of the Miami tribe, and serving 700 tribal citizens in Indiana and surrounding areas. Born in Indianapolis and grew up in Wabash County. Bachelor's degree from Indiana University and a master's degree from Ball State University and Georgetown University. She began working for the Miami tribe in 2015 when the tribe purchased property in Fort Wayne and opened a cultural resources extension office. Our next panelist is Vincent Newsom, Robert Settlement, an engineering group manager at the Delphi Corporation, engineer at GM Delco Electronics, adjunct instructor at IU Kokomo, Purdue programs, member of the board of directors of Robert Settlement, member of the Dean's Industrial Advisory Commission, IUPUI School of Engineering, trustee and member of Bethel AME Church Noblesville, recipient of the IUPUI School of Engineering Outstanding Alumnus Award, bachelor's in electrical engineering technology, and master's in manufacturing management. And last but not least is Reverend Dr. Marlene Pedigo. And with her permission, we get to call her Marlene this evening. Originally from Iowa, where she grew up among friends, graduated with a BA from William Penn College in elementary education, and later received a Master's of Divinity and Doctorate of Ministry from McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. Currently lives in Westfield, active among area Friends the past 8 years, and currently is researching the Friends testimony of women in the ministry, which began in the 1600s of England and flourished as Friends moved into Hamilton County. She's also researched the history of Friends' involvement in the Central Trail of the Underground Railroad. We'd like to welcome our listeners to feel free to send in your questions to any of our panelists in the chat. We'll do our best to have our panelists respond to as many as we can, time permitting. Let's think about what a pioneer is. We are talking about the pioneer experience in Noblesville and Hamilton County areas in particular. A pioneer is defined as one of the first to settle in a territory. A pioneer is defined as one of the first to settle in a territory. I'd like to invite each one of the panelists just to take a few moments to talk about the beginnings of the pioneer experience in our area. And David, if you would begin with the beginning pioneers in Noblesville and Hamilton County.
Right.
Okay, just take it off mute there. Yeah, I'm going to give a little bit of geographical background. That's taking it, when we're talking pioneers, I'm going way back. And the key point is that red line on this map. That's the Lafayette Trace. That was an ancient prehistoric game trail that ran really between the Ohio River and the Wabash River. Probably used it and first for migratory animals and things like that. And then about 10,000 years ago, the first humans came into the area following those animals. And naturally, they followed this natural path to go through there. One of the reasons why it's kind of key is that where it crosses up around where Strawtown is today, is there are several good river crossings right there. And so as a result, that became kind of an important sort of a thing. As a matter of fact, in the next slide, which we have, this shows the road that crossed it. This was, it didn't have a proper name. It basically ran from the Falls of the Ohio up through Washington County and some of the other places, up along the White River, and then up to Kikianga or Fort Wayne today. And that was another key route going from north to south. So Strawtown was right in the center of this key north-south, east-west route. So that's why about 1000 AD, we had our first real settlers in the area. And it was the Aborigines that settled up in the Strawtown area. And we're still doing archaeological research to find out more about them. So that's really kind of the roots of what happened right there. And of course, Diane's going to be able to tell you more about the Miami coming into Indiana and eventually becoming sort of the predominant tribe in this area. But nevertheless, they too would have used these routes to travel through the area. This is kind of the reason for that. So the next one actually shows kind of some of the things there. This is one of the first maps of Indiana that was drawn. This is from about 1819. And the nice thing about it is it actually shows this area. Because if you look towards the center of the map, you see a spot where it says Delaware Towns. And in the late 1700s, probably 1780s, maybe just after what was called the Northwest Indian War, the Delawares moved into the area and set up housekeeping along White River here. Although the Miamis were the predominant tribe and really controlled the area, the Delaware had been pushed from farther east, and so they came in here. And so they were the ones who were kind of occupying the towns and the areas, places around Strawtown and some different things like that. This area actually then was eventually, there was a treaty made, Treaty of St. Mary's. This was in 1818 after the War of 1812 and some other things. We actually know from the War of 1812 that those pathways were used. There were actually soldiers that actually used those roads to travel, well, to different places for confrontations. So we have some accounts of that. So now the next slide actually shows part of what that area became carved up into, and this became something known as Delaware County. There is another Delaware County today, but you can kind of see it looked very, very different back then. Indianapolis is a part of it. This was the first of the area. There were actually at one point in time just the two big counties, Wabash and Delaware County. But eventually those started getting carved up into smaller and smaller sections. And the next one kind of shows that a little bit better. This is from 1839. And the good thing about this is this shows the Miami Reserve. The Miamis, unlike the other tribes, actually managed to carve themselves out a certain amount of territory and were actually able to maintain a presence in the area for longer than the Delaware. The Delaware just simply headed west to Missouri, including William Connor's wife, among others. But nevertheless, this shows that they were able to at least maintain a presence here, and you see how Hamilton County at that point in time actually abutted it. There's that little bit of an angle that eventually became Tipton County, but still. The next slide actually is a closer up look at Hamilton County, and you get a good sense of the roads through this area. I like to use this map because this one actually shows a lot of the early trails. They don't often get included, but you see how it goes through Strawtown down to Noblesville. There's actually a road from Strawtown to Westfield, which is probably how the first Friends came into the area. The east-west road through Noblesville actually didn't exist until about 1836. And then the road that heads up to the northeast there, that is the Lafayette Trace kind of heading through the area. So this is like I say, transportation routes very, very key for a lot of these different groups to come into this area. As a matter of fact, Robert settlement, the Mullen settlement, the Busher settlement, all of these different early settlement groups tended to be fairly close to this Lafayette Trace. So as a result, they had a chance. This is kind of defines where they first landed there. Finally, the last image I've got here is kind of from 1843, and it's one little kind of significant line as well that kind of might be brought up at the thing, and that shows the canal. That was one of the attempts to add a new transportation route running from Anderson down to Indianapolis. Of course, we've seen the bits of the Central Canal that still exist in downtown Indianapolis. However, that of course went bankrupt as a result, and we were reliant on the roads and eventually other things as well. Eventually, the other transportation routes came in, things like the railroad, 1851, and that's really kind of the end of what we consider the pioneer period in this area, because it was no longer a matter of having to cut your way through the wilderness and how to establish the first settlements in these various spots. Once the railroad came in, it was a whole different type of person. So that's really kind of the basic geographic background on all of this.
And David, if I could ask you just a question here about the canal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the canal was operable for about how many years?
It never was north of Broad Ripple. The Central Canal was never finished. There are some cuts made in the canal at Strawtown, over over by Noblesville, some different things like that. Now, north of here, there was a canal that paralleled the Wabash River, the Wabash and Erie Canal, and that one is actually in use. It sort of existed until the 1870s, but other than that, once the 1830s, 1837 Depression hit, the state went bankrupt, all of the canals just died, and there was simply no way to make any of them work. So unfortunately, ours are just relegated to a bunch of kind of holes in the ground now. That's all we have left.
And so the canals were primarily in use to what, transport people or transport goods?
It was sort of a government provided transportation route. It's interesting, people ask about railroads and why railroads were not promoted more. People were a little hesitant about the technology in the 1830s, but even more significantly, the canals were like a road. Anybody could put a boat on it and go from point A to point B. You didn't have to ask permission. You didn't have to pay somebody. You didn't have to do something like that. You put a boat on it, you could use the canal. It's like a modern superhighway. Railroads, unfortunately, you can't do that. You have to buy a ticket. You have to check with everybody and know the schedule and do things like that. So the canals were psychologically, they were considered to be very democratic. Unfortunately, technologically and financially, they didn't work. So as a result, that's why we went to the roads, and eventually, as I say, to the railroads.
Thank you so much. And Diane, David mentioned about the dominance of the Miami tribe in our state. And if you could talk a little bit about the first settlements in this area here of the Miami tribe and kind of where it started at and how it developed. Thank you.
So I would like to just start from our beginning. Metame miamiake nipangonje sakachuwe chike. At first, the Miamis came out of the water. That's the first line of our earliest story. It's the story that tells of our emergence as Miami people. The place where we emerged, where we came out of the water, was a place we called Sakiweonge. And you can see on the map, up near Lake Michigan on the map that you see, there's a star, and that is Sakiweonge, the coming out place. And that's on the St. Joseph River. We're not exactly sure the location, but it was somewhere between South Bend and Lake Michigan on the St. Joseph River. And so Miami people have been in what is now Indiana since time immemorial. You can see here on the map a number of our villages. From Sakiweonge, we went out in many different directions, and this map just shows a few of our villages. Most of them that we are most familiar with today were along the Wapashikisipiwe, the Wabash River. Now, what is today Hamilton County was the hunting grounds for us. And those trails that David talked about, we used to get to other hunting grounds, to get to trading places. and also to fight with other tribes. We have a name, Chengwetanonge is what we call Indianapolis. So we know that that area was important to us because it has a name. We lived this way, as I say, since time immemorial until we first encountered Europeans. And our first contact with Europeans changed our lives dramatically. But probably an even more dramatic change was the Treaty of Paris of 1783 that ended the Revolutionary War. Because after that, the Americans started coming west, and they kept coming. And this was our land. We hadn't given it to anyone. We hadn't sold it to anyone. We hadn't ceded it to anyone. So from our perspective, those people coming onto this land were illegal aliens. And we didn't like it. And that ultimately led to war, which ended in the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. The Treaty of Greenville was supposed to solve everything. Everybody would have part of their land. The Americans got most of what is now Ohio. They got little bits of Indiana. We had the rest. We were happy. But then there were more treaties where we ceded more and more land. So there was a treaty in 1805. There was a treaty in 1809. If you go to the next map, you can see, as David talked about, the Treaty of St. Mary's, and that patch there in the middle, she was just pointing to, was what was ceded, the pink there, is what was ceded in the Treaty of St. Mary's. And that includes, as David mentioned, today's Hamilton. Now also, you can't see it on this map, but there was a reserve set aside at Thorntown. The same Thorntown that is today in Boone County, just next to Hamilton County. Thorntown was a village, a Miami village was there. And so that was set aside in the Treaty of St. Mary's in 1818 as a Miami reserve. Unfortunately, it only lasted 10 years because it was ceded in the Treaty of 1828, just 10 years later. So there were more treaties. There were treaties in 1826, 1828, 1834, 1838. If you go to the next map, by 1838, that Great Miami Reserve was all we had. All the rest of what is today Indiana had been ceded. And it went from the Wabash River down to, basically, as David pointed out, down to Hamilton County. And so that was the last piece of tribal land that we had at that point. Our most significant treaty, though, was 2 years later in 1840. And in that treaty, we agreed to exchange the Great Miami Reserve. It was about 500,000 acres. And we agreed to exchange it for what was supposed to be about the same size land in Kansas. And more importantly, we agreed that we would be removed to Kansas. Now, we didn't want to go, and we did everything we could to put it off, to not have to go. But in 1846, in October, the US Army came with their guns and rounded us up and loaded us onto those canal boats at Peru. And we took the canals from Peru through Fort Wayne into Ohio, down the Miami and Erie Canal to Cincinnati, and then we took steamboats to the Kansas Landing, which is today Kansas City, and walked 50 miles, or went over land anyway, 50 miles south to Sugar Creek in Kansas, which was our new reserve. We were only there 20 years before the US government wanted us to go on again, and we had a second removal to Oklahoma around the early 1870s. Our tribal government is today in Miami, Oklahoma, in Ottawa County, northeastern Oklahoma. But we have still 700 citizens of our tribe here living in Indiana. And I work at our Cultural Resources Extension Office in Fort Wayne. And part of my job is to serve those 700 citizens of our tribe still in Indiana. So that brings us up to date.
All right, thank you, Diane. Vincent, talk a little bit about the beginnings of the pioneer experience as far as Robert's settlement is concerned. And I know your perspective is coming to us as a direct descendant of one of the pioneer founders.
Vincent, you're on mute.
Am I on now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. My perspective is really, as LaValla said, as a descendant of Robert's settlement. So the picture that you see there, the map that's been provided, shows some of the ownership of property around Robert's settlement at the time. As you may know, Robert's settlement is probably about 10 or 12 miles north of Noblesville. If you go up 31 to 276th Street, right in that area is where Robert's settlement's at. Today, there's the one thing that stands out is a church that's standing there. That's the Roberts Chapel Church. So if we go to the next slide. Right there. I wanted to show this because this really summarizes our history. 4 years ago, there was a historical marker placed on the church lawn, and it really tells the story of the Roberts family. And when I say Roberts was really the prime, I'll say the largest number of people were named Roberts that migrated from North Carolina at the time. There were Newsomes, there were Wimburns, there were Cunninghams, there were Matthews, there were a lot of other ones. But because Robert was kind of the predominant surname, that's the name that people have chosen to name Robert as Robert's settlement. So when they left North Carolina, and some of the people came from Virginia as well, they were free people of color. And that migration began around 1820 because of some of the upheaval that was occurring out there, racial tensions, some rebellions that occurred out there, like with the Nat Turner Rebellion and all of that. So it was, and many of my ancestors were landholders, and so they were in jeopardy of having land out there in the South, and so. They migrated, and there's another settlement that's over in the central east part near Carthage, Indiana, that's called the Beach. Some of them migrated there, and some of them continued on to Robert's settlement in Jackson Township. And the three pioneers were Elijah Roberts, Micaiah Walden, and also Hansel Roberts. I'm a direct descendant of Hansel Robert. He is my great grandfather, and so in the early years, by 1838, Robert's settlement farmers owned over 900 acres, and in 1847, residents built a school and a church meeting house. So the school is not standing today, but the church is still standing. At that time, we were associated early on with the Wesleyan Methodist denomination. And so most of the livelihood and all that was dependent on farming. So over time, there was a strong emphasis on education. If you talk to anyone about Robert's settlement, there's several words that stand out. And one is thrifty, one is moral, one is education, one is respected. So I think the community itself was very well respected and recognized. And as I said, I was actually, until I was about 12 years old, raised on a farm in Robert Settlement. My dad was a farmer. And so I saw firsthand what the farmers did and so forth. And I can only imagine the early pioneers like Hansel Roberts, my great-great-great-great-grandfather. When they came to that land up there, it was not like the nice rolling fields that you see today. It was a lot of land needed to be, trees needed to be removed and all of that to be able to use the field. So that they did that over a course of years, I'm sure. And there, I just want to reference a couple of books that, a book that's been written by Dr. Stephen Vincent. It's called Southern Seed, Northern Soil. And he wrote that book, and it's about the Beach settlement and the Roberts settlement. And it really is, a very scholarly work on the history of Roberts settlement. Could we go to the next slide, please? I know this is an eye chart here. The next two are eye charts, but I wanted to say there was a strong emphasis on education. And you can see from this slide that many of my ancestors were clergy members, were educators. They worked in the medical field. And so initially, most of them were farmers, but over time that changed. And they went off to school and so forth. Continue on to the next slide after that. There you go. This is the picture of the schoolhouse number 5 that was at Roberts Settlement, established in 1877. And this particular photo was taken in about 1913. I know I'm outside of the pioneer movement. However, I just wanted to illustrate here the education that was so important. This was primarily a colored school, quote unquote. However, there were white children that attended this school as well, but it was well respected and on par with the other schools in the area, it said. And as I mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned that my great-grandfather was a teacher at this school as well. One thing we do and has been established is a homecoming. And that homecoming was established in 1924. There were actually reunions earlier than that. However, officially the Roberts Settlement homecoming began in 1924. So this has continued on. Actually, this year was our 97th year. Even though we didn't get together because of the COVID-19 this year, it was done virtually. So what we're saying is we have done it continuously the last 97 years. And so what's interesting about that is generally there's always a few people that are new, that have never been there before, that are looking for their ancestors, looking for their relatives. And so we'll always have new people that will come every year to learn more about their own history. So I think that's all I had.
All right, thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Vincent. And Marlene, if you could tell us about Quaker pioneers in our area.
Marlene, you're on mute.
All right, can you hear me now? Okay. What you have in front of you is a map of the Friends churches, and it shows the meetings that have an X in by the name were in existence by 1858. And after that, all the other meetings were added, which is another name for churches. by 1908. I think it's a good map in the fact that it shows historically that the Friends settled quite densely in this area. And having lived in Chicago for 30 years, there were like less than 1,000 people in the metropolitan area who would have Friends membership. And here in Hamilton County, there were a lot of Friends churches. So they had a big settlement. Most of the Friends churches that were coming here were developed by individuals who were coming out of North Carolina in resistance to slavery and embracing Indiana as that free slave state. They were trying to bring slaves and set them free here, and they were trying to be a part of helping any individual who was coming through on the Central Trail of the Underground Railroad continue their journey or even settle here. Friends historically have what's called monthly meeting or yearly meeting minutes, which is they have business practices where each local congregation keeps minutes of whatever it is they're doing business-wise, and the yearly meeting keeps annual business meeting records. And this particular yearly meeting, I don't think anybody has ever really looked at the history of how the Friends were active in this county from the minutes of the yearly meeting. Western Yearly Meeting, which is the judicatory for Hamilton County at this time, had several churches, and many of them had women in the ministry, recorded women in the ministry who were active working with the slaves for education and starting what they called first day schools, we would now call Sunday schools. And it's interesting that the yearly meeting records all of this. They had a chart, it's almost like a census chart, where every year they would put down how many freedmen were staying in their area, in that church area, how many of them were being educated, how many of them went to the first day school. So they really had a concern for the spiritual development and the education of freedmen. And I think it's interesting that also the yearly meeting minutes indicate that they were helping to spend money. Here in Westfield, they expanded $32.60 in aiding of a schoolhouse one year to help children have an education. They gave money, $3.35 to help a boy to keep him from being sold into slavery. And so in these minute books, it tells the story of how much money they're expending and what they're actually doing, how many first day schools they were having, how many kids were coming to their schools. And I think it's interesting that it shows that they were embracing this as a very important ministry of the Friends. The women were very significant in this area. Drusilla Wilson, who was a recorded Friends minister down in what we call Carmel now, but at that time it was called Bethlehem, and she was a part of a particular meeting which was called Poplar Grove. She came from Ohio, and she was actually the first clerk of Western Yearly Meeting Women's Group. And after the Civil War, went down to Mississippi and helped to start schools in Mississippi to train teachers after the Civil War, and then went to Kansas and worked among the meetings out there for temperance. But she was very committed to educating the slaves and the freedmen as they were coming through. The Tomlinsons, if you're very familiar with the Westfield area, her husband was named Robert. They lived 2.5 miles or so north of downtown Westfield, near to what was called Chester Cemetery. Yeah, there's Drusilla Wilson in front of you right now. She was one of the very significant women in ministry among the Friends at that time. And you find in the records that they came because they wanted to help with the anti-slavery movement. And he was the conductor in the Underground Railroad for the Westfield area, and were very involved in helping to shelter slaves as they were going through. And the Tomlinsons are currently buried in that Chester Cemetery, which is right next to Highway 31. Sarah Hyatt was another one from the Westfield area. Her and her husband were recorded ministers in Westfield Friends. She's buried in the old cemetery, Old Friends Cemetery here in Westfield. And they had a barn just south of Westfield. The Tomlinsons were north and the Hyatts were south. They were about 2 miles south of Westfield. And their barn was used on the Underground Railroad. And then another very important recorded Friends minister was Asmus Clark. Her maiden name was Hunt. She came from the New Garden area in North Carolina. Her and her husband, he was also recorded Friends minister. They were very involved in the New Garden Friends meeting. There was a boarding school there. They had 6 boys, so I can imagine that. They helped in that development of that school, and then did a lot of traveling in the ministry, but then came to the Eagle Creek area. The Greenwood Eagle Creek area, there's only a cemetery left now of Greenwood, but they were very involved in development of the first day schools, and I imagine she was one of the driving forces of what was going on, of helping develop these first day schools among the freedmen of the Westfield area. I find it interesting that we're talking about the developing of a welcoming community, and these women were significant in that happening, I think, for the Westfield area. And a lot of times we talk about Levi Coffin, and he was a part of the Eastern Trail of the Underground Railroad, but the women of Western Yearly Meeting, they were very involved in this ministry too. So I think those are, I think you have one more picture of just the tombstone. Yes, there she is. I don't have a picture of her yet. I hope to one day have a picture of her, but she was a very significant person. Not only did she help develop this school, which was a Friends school in Greensboro, and later became Guilford College, but her son, Dugan Clark, became one of the very first theologians, theology professors at Earlham. And so this was a very significant family, very involved in education, and they were using their gifts here in Westfield among the freedmen. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Marlene.
Mm-hmm.
David, can you tell us from your perspective why so many diverse groups of people started a new life in our area of Noblesville or Hamilton County? What was it, or what were some of the things that drew them to our area in Indiana?
Here, there we go. Okay, unmuting. Yeah, actually, unfortunately, one of the things that brought a lot of the other groups here was cheap land, which we had taken from the Miami and from the Delaware. So it's kind of cross purposes for as far as settlement goes and things like that. But like I say, inexpensive land, new land. As I say, one of the things about this area is that it was accessible, among other things. We were talking about the huge forest around where Robert's settlement was. The thing is that literally we have stories from the 1820s of people trying to get from point A to point B, trying to get from like Strawtown to Thorntown. It takes them a week and they get lost in the woods. So it's a tremendous effort. And until that ground starts getting cleared away, it's just part of that there. But once they did get there, the land was inexpensive. It was very, very good land. That forest had turned up some very good types of land. Actually, the Delaware had set up some very good farms. There's something called a pocket prairie down along the river where there's river bends where the river tends to kill a lot of trees. And it's just naturally easy to do farming in that area. So as a result, as I say, unfortunately for the Native Americans, the land was just really too good and too cheap. And so that's why a lot of the others saw the opportunity. Now, it's nice that you did have people like the Quaker settlements and the Robert settlement folks and, like I say, the Mullen and Busher settlements with the Catholic folks there, who kind of understood that this was not just free for the picking, that there was issues involved there. So that's kind of some of it right there.
And Diane, you might be able to tell us a little bit about you had the Miami tribes. Several were in our area and what have you, and then you had the Delaware that was in the area as well, and then you have certain of your land that was taken over, so on and so forth. Is there any sovereign land that remains with the Miami tribes in Indiana?
Not in Indiana. There is one about an acre that has been owned consistently by a Miami person. 1 acre. But tribal land, no, there hasn't been. Since we ceded the Great Miami Reserve in 1840, there has been no tribal land as opposed to individually owned land in Indiana. However, now the tribe does own some land. It's fee simple, so it doesn't fall within our trust. But we're rebuilding it in a way.
So when that was taking place, so was there another migration that the Miami tribe took?
We just kept reducing and reducing. A lot of the land initially, because the land that was ceded in Indiana was primarily from the Ohio River, and then each treaty took more and more further north. And so we just retreated into smaller and smaller areas. It took more and more of our hunting grounds, which made it very difficult to support ourselves. And so in the treaties, we were given annuities, given annual payments in exchange for the land, but really in exchange for our ability to support ourselves and to feed ourselves. The annuities were to pay for us to be able to eat and buy food because we couldn't do it for ourselves anymore in the way that we had done since time immemorial.
So Vincent spoke a little bit about the educational experience at Robert's settlement. What was it like for the Miami tribe regarding education for the youth?
We have always valued education, and particularly during the period that we're talking about, we saw that it was very important that our future leaders become educated in the ways of the Americans so that they would know the language, they would understand the culture, and therefore they could better negotiate and interact and trade with the Americans. So we valued that. In about 1823, at the beginning of the period we're talking about, up until then, Isaac McCoy had a Baptist school in Fort Wayne, and Miami people went there. Then later, we sent our young men to the Choctaw Academy in Kentucky. In the late 40s, some of the Richardville boys went to Notre Dame, and some of our girls, the Richardville girls, went to a Catholic school in Fort Wayne. And also there was a Catholic school in Vincennes, and for a very brief period, 3 young men were sent there, one of them being my grandmother's father. So we took advantage of what schools were available to us because we did see the value in education. And later in Kansas, we sought out schools for our reservation there as well.
Okay, and just a reminder for anybody who may have joined us late, welcome to the History of Noblesville. This is the first of a four-part learning series sponsored by the Noblesville Diversity Coalition. And today's presentation is regarding pioneers, diversity in Noblesville and Hamilton County, Indiana, around the period of 1823 to 1851. And our panel today, David Highway, Diane Hunter, Vincent Newsom, and Marlene Pedigo. Thank you so much. And also as a reminder, keep your questions coming in on the chat. We will do our best to get them all answered, time permitting, before we close out today. In the Now you had mentioned, Marlene, about with the Friends, also known as the Quakers, how they had made some changes as far as being able to make a contribution in supporting the Underground Railroad. They became abolitionists, what have you. Can you talk about how that developed in your group, in your Friends organization, how that transition occurred and why it occurred?
What I could say is that about 100 years before the Civil War, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting came to clearness that slavery was wrong and started encouraging all the members to let go of all the slaves. That started rippling across the yearly meetings. In North Carolina, as individuals saw the horrible treatment of what was going on, they decided when Indiana became a freed state to migrate here and to be able to let their slaves go if they had them, or to be able to help people find freedom here in Indiana. And not only did that happen for them, but they also felt the importance of education. And as the Friends came here, at that time it was illegal to educate African Americans or slaves, and yet the Friends were beginning to do that. And you find that they are developing schools. In the Yearly Meeting Minute books, you find that the number of young people here in this area that were coming to the schools. And I think that Western Yearly Meeting, which is the judicatory for this area, had a clear minute saying that slavery was wrong, and that if anybody was in the Friends churches and still had any kind of inkling that that was okay, they would sit down and talk with them and labor with them until they saw the light, so to speak. There was some division here in Westfield between the anti-slavery and the Westfield Friends, but as soon, it was more over the Underground Railroad tactics, I think, than the fact that slavery was really wrong. I think that's probably, and as I said before, the whole importance of education and spiritual education with the first day schools was very huge with the Friends.
Thank you very much. And Vincent, was it a welcoming experience for Roberts Settlement when they founded that community in Atlanta, Indiana?
I think probably the fact that the Friends were here probably created obviously created a better environment for them. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why they settled in this area. Now there, as I think was mentioned earlier, there were Quakers out in North Carolina, and maybe there was some connection there between the Quakers here in Indiana. I don't know. But I know one of I think I've heard that, and even Stephen Vincent mentions that in his book, that one of the reasons they settled where they did was it was an area where it was fairly close to Quakers, and the Quakers, beliefs and on the abolitionist movement and race were important, obviously, to Roberts Settlement. So I think they were supportive of education for Roberts Settlement too.
And were there many connections that you know of, Marlene and Diane, between the Friends as well as the Native American community?
Well, I could just go ahead. Do you want to go ahead? Go ahead, Diane.
There were some connections at one point. I believe in the early 1800s, some Quakers were brought out to teach our men how to farm. That didn't go very well because our men were not interested in doing women's work. and farming was women's work. And so that kind of was a failure.
What about Marlene? Was there? I know that the Friends did embrace cultures and people that were different than them. And do you recall anything directly in Indiana that kind of developed that relationship with, whether it be the Miami tribe or Delaware tribe that you know of?
When Western Yearly Meeting was started, they had developed this committee on the freedmen, or people of color at one time it was called. They also had one that was on the, they called it the Friends Committee on Indian Affairs, I think is what the technical name was at that time. And they were very interested at that time. I don't know about the Miami. This is new to me. I'm not quite sure exactly which one of the tribes they were very concerned about at that time. I'd have to do more research on that. Most of my work has been the Underground Railroad, but they had that committee right at the very beginning, which had that concern and had been doing supplies here in Westfield. They have been going out to Kansas still, to the Kickapoo in the Oklahoma area. I would say still, even to this day, concerned about what was going on with the Native Americans. And in Iowa, there's a Meskwaki settlement. Yeah, the Friends have historically been very involved with that too. And I think it's all about, you know, they weren't Calvinists. Their theology was not Calvinism. They believed, George Fox really believed that everybody was created in the image of God. There was a seed of God in all people. And because of that belief, you know, they didn't believe that the total depravity of sin, and they didn't believe in predestination. That really made a huge difference, not just on who they were willing to embrace, but also then liberating for women for ministry. So Friends have historically also been very involved in women rights issues, and Susan B. Anthony was a Friends woman, very involved.
Right.
So I think a lot of that has to do with their concerns.
And I've got a question that comes in from the audience for you, David, from Kim. Is there any record of how many African Americans were living in Hamilton County in the 1830s and 1840s outside of Robert's settlement?
That's a great question, actually, and we do have actually precise numbers of African Americans in the county thanks to the census records. 1830, there is one African American living in the county. That's Thomas Murphy. He actually came in with George Boxley. He was actually more Quaker connected than he was with Robert's settlement. 1840, after the establishment of Robert's settlement, we've got 67 African Americans out of a population of 9,855. Primarily, that's Robert's settlement people. That is really the influx there. 1850, we've got 188 African Americans out of a population of 1,200 or so. And that's when you start to see Underground Railroad influx. There are people who are definitely moving in on the Underground Railroad. Excuse me. And others who are, in fact, just moving to the area. The Elliots, for instance, in the Noblesville area. Yeah, once the Quakers got the Underground Railroad going, once they established this as a safe area, you had things like the Rhodes family in the 1830s and 1837, who came here on the Underground Railroad, escaping from slavery, and decided to settle here. And then, of course, had the famous case in 1844. So yeah, so that was that population outside of Robert's settlement. We haven't really divided it down yet. That would be interesting to find out those numbers. So.
There's also another question here, and it might go to you again, David, from Teresa, who asks, were there any merchandise trading opportunities, such as stores, markets, etc., early in the Roberts settlement area?
Unless Vincent or Brian knows of another one, they tended to go to Westfield, to Arcadia, to Noblesville, and get involved with a lot of the economy there. There was just, of course, once the railroad came through, that's where the money was. And the thing is, the nice thing about Westfield is that the Quakers there obviously had no problems at all working with African Americans on a financial basis. There were a lot of places where it didn't work out very well. But Westfield, there were, in later years, actually African American businessmen and business people who worked in that area. So.
And I wonder how much, was there any business done in Sheridan with Boxley or in that time period?
It's interesting. Thomas Murphy, who was there before, who came in 1828 with George Boxley, actually ended up working down in Noblesville with William Connor and his family there. Eventually, he moved his way over to Strawtown. Boxley was, there wasn't much there. And of course, Sheridan didn't show up until 1866 or thereabouts.
Okay.
So it was, where did you find economic stuff? Strawtown, Arcadia, Noblesville, Westfield.
Okay.
That was just simply where the opportunity was.
Well, there's another question that comes from Lisa. Do connections still exist today between Robert's descendants and the Quaker descendants?
In terms of, you're talking about in terms of just working together, or when you say connections?
That's kind of what I gather here, yes.
Okay. I know of no necessarily formal or informal tie necessarily. I guess I can't speak to that. I don't know.
But this might produce a good opportunity to
It
consider
could.
something like that.
It could.
All right. And
It looks like Brian may have something to jump in. I saw a hand raise.
okay, put on your mic. You're mute.
Unmute yourself. There you go.
There you go.
Okay. I think Vincent is correct. There isn't an ongoing relationship per se. I think one of the questions that I sent out to Marlene is, one of the things I've been curious about is in the Quaker in the Friends minutes, if there's any history of and documentation about that relationship between the Robert settlement people and the local Quakers as far as the Underground Railroad goes. I don't think we've been able to find anything in our records because it's probably not something a person would want to write down, just because there were still plenty of people in the area looking to capture slaves, and Robert settlement would be a likely place to look for them. But it would be nice to kind of work together and see if we can't find ways to merge our history and tell our stories mutually as far as that relationship goes back in those early pioneer days, because we just don't have a lot of documentation on it.
But I do think, though, that the Robert settlement tended to work with the Wesleyan Church, and more from a religious standpoint because of their abolitionist views and
we've tried. Yes, we've been trying that angle too. Again, trying to find out what is in their minutes and records about that relationship as well. And we have found some of those at the Wesleyan headquarters over in Fishers, some of the old Wesleyan newspapers. But I've always been hoping that maybe the Quakers have something that had been written down and put away that we might be able to look back on and see what was happening in that relationship, because there were so many living around Robert settlement at the time of the Underground Railroad.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Thank you.
If I could
Yes,
just
Marlene?
jump into that conversation, because I've been looking at the minutes of the yearly meeting, and to my knowledge, so far, there's not a connection between those two. A lot of what the Friends are doing, I told you they have this little census form that they filled out every year with how many freedmen were living in their area. This was called the Union Quarterly Meeting. Hamilton County was. And so they was like this, well, this is a little bit later. This is 1868. But in this quarterly meeting, which would be the Westfield quarter, they had 144 people of color that was living here. This was not a settlement. They were just in a variety of different, they had property all over, I guess, and just were involved. They had them going to school. They had these first day schools. They was talk about how much money they helped to give to support this ministry. And that's what you have. I didn't really know about the Robert settlement till I came to Westfield. I didn't see that in their records, but that doesn't mean that the local friends here at that time didn't realize that that existed. A lot of records are still in people's attics and still, you know, not always available until you start asking friends, oh, does anybody have a picture of Drusilla Wilson or somebody like that? And all of a sudden you start getting the information. So as we start talking more about this, maybe more of the information will emerge. That would be my hope.
I have a question here for the entire panel that would like to answer this. What, if any, significant social changes occurred during this pioneer period, and what was their impact on whether it be the city, Roberts settlement, Miami tribe, or friends? What, if any, significant social changes occurred during that pioneer period, and what was their impact?
I'll jump in here. As I mentioned, it was during this period that our forced removal occurred. But there were a few families that were allowed to stay in Indiana and a few more who went on removal and came back. But what that meant was that we had a dispersed tribe. We had people in Indiana, and then we had people in Kansas, and then we had people in Oklahoma. And today we have people all over the United States and beyond. And what that means is that when you have a very small number of people living among a much greater number of people who are not part of who we are, there's a lot of assimilation and a lot of loss of our culture and a loss of our language. Our last native speakers died in the 1960s. So there was a lot of loss. A lot of things just went to sleep. And starting in the 1990s, we began a program, a Miami Awakening. And we are reviving our culture. We're learning our language again. And we're in a period of cultural revitalization. But the result of that period was great loss for us.
Now, is that awakening, is that primarily taking place in Oklahoma, or how's that set up?
It's taking place everywhere. In Oklahoma, here in Indiana, that's one of the things that we do at our Cultural Resources Extension Office, is we have programs where people can learn language, where people can participate in cultural activities. We have the Miami Center at Miami University in Ohio, and they are kind of leading the way in terms of the research that's necessary for this revitalization. And we have camps, summer camps for our children where they can come and learn language and learn about the culture, and a lot of online material as well. So any Miami person, wherever we are, has an opportunity to participate in this revitalization.
And Diane, do you have any idea as to how many Miami natives are still in Indiana?
We have about 700 citizens of the tribe in Indiana. I know there are some who are Miami descendants and are not citizens of the tribe for their own personal reasons. But
so it's 700 today compared to what was it at its height?
Oh, at our height, maybe 20,000, but that would have been back in the 17th century.
Okay.
Yeah, at removal, there were probably at most 600, I think about 600 people total at the time of our removal.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Any other comments regarding significant social changes that occurred during the pioneer period and what their impact was on the city of Noblesville or Hamilton County? Any thoughts about that, David?
There actually was one thing that I did want to bring up real quick, and that was the population change between about 1830 and 1840, when the Quakers came in, when the Robert Settlement folks came in, when the other groups came in. Between 1830 and 1840, we had about a 400% rise in population. It was enormous. It was a tidal wave. And so as a result, we really did change a lot. You look at Hamilton County, what was Hamilton County in the 1820s when it was first formed, and it was all very, very crude and still, like I say, very backwoods. By the 1840s, end of the 1840s, it's really becoming populated. It's really becoming, settled. The trees are being cleared. All of this kind of stuff. So, yeah, that little period in there between 1830 and 1840 was just a huge spike in the population. And it's interesting because there are other periods later on that we'll be dealing with in future these sessions, where there would be another spike in the population due to environmental or economic things or something like that. So, so that was the big change, was just this incredible growth in the settlers coming in, and unfortunately the natives moving out. So,
Sure. Now, before we close here, I'd like to ask the panelists on the takeaways that you envision from opportunities like this, in sharing your stories with communities and looking at this as a learning event. Can you share your perspective as to the takeaway you think a community can derive from these types of events? Vincent?
Well, I think what, I've learned from the other panelists, things that I didn't really know. And I think it just helps us educate kind of where we're coming from in terms of our history. And I sort of knew about the Native American history in a way, but not necessarily in the detail that was described today. So I think it just helps us understand a little bit more about, people's background, where they come from. I think it just makes us a better person, to know, the background of other people and kind of their values and so forth. And then in the ways that we've helped each other over time, like the friends with the Robert Settlement and and so forth. But, it's helped to enlighten me a little bit on that.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Marlene?
I think this is very important. As Hamilton County grows, as towns like Westville grow into cities, people who are new need to know that they're not coming into a vacuum, and that there is history in the towns and in the communities to which they move to. And I find that a lot of times people do not know the Friends. They think, oh, the Quaker oatmeal box people. They really don't know who they
Right.
were. They don't understand their concern of why they were here, what they were trying to do, that there was a culture of Westfield that existed before 20 or 30 years ago. So I would like to lift that up. I do believe the Friends really set the tone for the importance of education, not just in this particular town of Westfield, but throughout the state of Indiana. I do believe that the women in ministry that I was talking about before, those women that were involved really went on to talk and become leaders in the women's rights to vote. This was not just a singular thing that they were concerned about. They were developing leadership of women, which went on to other social issues. And I think telling our story is super important. I'm talking now as a religious person, because as we talk a lot now about community churches, we don't always know that not everybody believed the same thing. So I appreciate this opportunity to tell my story, to tell our story, to listen to the other stories that have been told tonight. And I think it's a rich diversity who supposedly, when we had that Black Lives Matter march here in Westfield a few weeks back, people were so upset. And I said, you know, the Friends moved here years ago because the Black Lives mattered even then. And this is not this is not a new thing. We can all come behind this. And yeah, I think we need to continue to tell our stories.
Thank you for that viewpoint. I appreciate that. Diane, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I would echo what Vincent and Marlene have said. I appreciate Marlene's comment about the throats, because I think that as Native peoples, we have some of that same thing. Our story has been told in such a sanitized way that there's almost little truth in it, and often what people are told in schools and in other places. So I really appreciate the opportunity like this to talk about who we were, to talk about our history, to talk about our presence in Indiana, but also that we are still here. We're always shocked to find out how many people think that Indians are extinct in Indiana. And we've heard that many times, and you know, we're here. And we like to really appreciate the opportunity to share that we are here, and we are a vital and growing people. And so I thank you for the opportunity to do this.
Thank you, thank you. And David.
I really have nothing to add. I mean, it has been so well stated by Vincent and Diane and Marlene. And it's great to hear other voices. That's one of the fun things about this. I mean, I am the county historian, and so I go out and I do talks to kids and things like that, but it's my view of the story, and there are things that I'm going to miss just because of my background and things like that. So it's great to hear these other voices and to bring these other voices into the conversation to add so much more depth to what's being said.
Thank you so much. And as we close, be sure to go to the Noblesville Diversity Coalition Facebook site to stay on top of our upcoming events and other useful information. As a reminder, our next episode, From Railroads to Gaslights, Myths and Misconceptions of Noblesville Diversity 1850 to 1900, will take place on September 3rd, 7 to 8 p.m. via Zoom. Please be sure to register for that. And on behalf of the Noblesville Diversity Coalition and our committee that was formed to put this particular series together, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for sharing your experiences, your expertise, and your time. It's been invaluable for our community. And I hope that we will stay in touch with you for a long, long time to come. Just take a moment to reach out to different groups, to different cultures, to different experiences, and you'll find that there is a lot to offer and a lot to know about. The mission of the Noblesville Diversity Coalition is to educate, celebrate, challenge, and inspire Noblesville to be a welcoming and inclusive community that embraces all cultures and identities. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and stay safe.
Okay.
Good night, Noblesville.
Good night.
Thank you.
Okay, Vincent's still there. Jen is still there. Why isn't my picture up? I don't know. Can you see me, Jen?
No, I can't. I sent you a text.
Oh, I didn't know what that meant.
Yeah, you were all dark. Someone else is still in here, but I'm not sure who. It's like Lisa.
So Lavala, did you want us to stay on then, or would we?
Let's see if
Yeah.
everybody signed off.
I think everyone signed off. Yeah.
Lisa.
Okay.
We were gonna talk, but
Okay. Hey, oh, Vincent. How do you
Yes.
think it went?
I thought it went really, really well. Well, I think the presenters there